America and other free and open societies face crucial challenges and opportunities abroad that affect security and prosperity at home. This is a series of conversations with guests who bring deep understanding of today's battlegrounds and creative ideas about how to compete, overcome challenges, capitalize on opportunities, and secure a better future. I am H.R. McMaster. This is Battlegrounds.
In today's episode of Battlegrounds, our focus is on the country of Australia, an ally since the Anzac Treaty was ratified in 1951. Our guest is the Honourable Julie Bishop. Ms. Bishop is regarded as one of Australia's finest ministers for foreign affairs, serving from 2013 to 2018, and was the first woman appointed to that role. One of her enduring legacies as foreign minister will be the New Colombo Plan, which has supported thousands of Australian undergraduate students to undertake part of their studies in nations of the Indo-Pacific region. She was also responsible for the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper, which was released to guide Australian external policy over the next decade and beyond, the first such document produced since 2003. Ms. Bishop was a senior member of Australia's National Security Committee and responsible for the oversight of Australia's Secret Intelligence Service, the counterpart to the CIA. She had a successful political career, holding the deputy leadership of her political party for 10 years while winning 6 consecutive elections. Ms. Bishop had a distinguished legal career prior to politics and rose to be managing partner of a large national legal firm in Western Australia. She is the Chancellor of the Australian National University and serves on a number of commercial advisory and not-for-profit boards. Ms. Bishop joins us from Australia, a country originally inhabited by Aboriginal Australians that have inhabited the mainland and cultivated rich and enduring artistic and spiritual traditions since prehistoric times. Europeans began to land in Australia in the early 17th century. The British first landed in Australia in 1770 and established the penal colony of New South Wales in 1788. The Commonwealth of Australia was established in 1901, 150 years after American independence. The government of Australia, as outlined in its constitution, reflects influences from both the U.S. federal system and the British constitutional monarchy. The United States and Australia have followed similar trajectories through the history of the 20th century. The creation of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, or Anzac, in World War I was Australia's first foray onto the international stage and left a lasting legacy in Australian and New Zealand culture. Australia also experienced the hardship of the Great Depression, and almost 1 million Australians fought with the Allies in both the European and Pacific theaters during World War II. Following the war, Australia established a massive immigration program that saw hundreds of thousands of Europeans move to Australia to work in the country's expanding post-war economy and contribute to Australia's multicultural society. Australia fought with the United States in all major wars of the 20th century and is a member of the Five Eyes, a group of the U.S.'s most trusted intelligence-sharing allies. The 2005 Australia-United States Free Trade Agreement, AUSFTA, has been responsible for increasing investment between the two countries by 283%. However, Australia's international experience diverged with the United States following the great financial crisis of 2008-2009, when it did not experience a downturn associated with the crisis. Instead, Australia has had a positive GDP growth rate since 1992 and seen robust trade in mining and agriculture, leading to government budget surpluses and above-average standings in income and wealth, environmental quality, health status, housing, jobs and earnings, education and skills, subjective well-being, social connections, and personal security. Its 28 years of consecutive economic growth is a world record amongst major economies, and only came to an end in 2020 due to the pandemic. Australia's trade growth is attributable in part to its reliance on China as a consistent trade partner in mining, agriculture, real estate, higher educational exchange, and a provider of foreign direct investment. China accounts for almost a third of Australia's exports, and Chinese students make up 10% of the Australian university population. The commingling of Chinese interests in Australian policies and trade exploded in 2015 when China poured investment and influence into Australia. Signing of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank made Australia a strategic partner of China, which then ushered in the long-sought-after China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. A Chinese company obtained a 99-year lease of Australia's northernmost port in Darwin, and the state of Victoria defied the national government and joined the Belt and Road Initiative. Indeed, Beijing's United Front have expended considerable resources and efforts targeted at politicians, businesses, community groups, and individuals in an attempt to build support for Chinese Communist Party policies on issues such as the South China Sea and Taiwan. Australia, with its almost 40,000-kilometer coastal border, is a strong supporter of a free and open Pacific, and the government is increasing its support for close coordination with the Quad. The relationship between Australia and the U.S. remains steadfast, with at least 70% of the Australian public supportive of its alliance with the U.S. over the past 12 years. We talked to Ms. Bishop at a time when the trade-offs between national security and private sector growth, trade, and climate change are being brought to the forefront of both Australian and American society.
Julie, welcome to Battlegrounds. Let me begin by saying what an honor it was to serve alongside you. I remember fondly, I think it was my first full day in the White House. I had the opportunity to meet with you, and you graciously joined me in my empty White House office where I found myself quite unexpectedly. And you gave me the benefit of your perspective on the challenges that we were facing and then how we might work together to overcome those challenges and help build a better future for both our countries and the free world. And it was quite an honor that day, and it's great to see you again. Thank you.
Well, General, it's great to be with you as well. And I well remember our first meeting. It was your first day as National Security Advisor. I think it had been announced earlier that morning, and you were so kind to meet with me. My trip to Washington coincided with your announcement. And I do remember sitting in your office. You barely had your feet under the desk. And we talked about the great relationship between the United States and Australia, that alliance that has endured for so many decades. And our friendship, of course, goes way back to probably the beginning of the 20th century. But our alliance, formally from 1951, has been the bedrock of Australia's security, defence, intelligence policy platform ever since that time. And we had a wonderful chat, and I'm delighted to join you today.
Well, thank you, Julie. And at that time, I remember you offered a tour de force of the critical challenges that are important to both our countries and really the free world. And so what would you tell us today, Julie, about the view of the challenges we're facing, the opportunities we're facing from the perspective of Australia?
Well, no question, we are all in the grip of this global pandemic, although I must confess that Australia is in a better position currently than most other countries around the world. We're an island continent, so we went into lockdown very early on, and we have external borders. We don't allow people in or people out without the harshest of restrictions, might I say. So Australia's infection rate is very low, virtually nil at this point, but I know that this global pandemic is raging around the world, and that will continue to be a challenge for the new administration in the United States, for Europe, for countries where it hasn't even hit its first wave, let alone the second wave. And I think the lessons to be learned from the global pandemic will be profound. And that will, perhaps later in our discussion, bring me back to US global leadership. Secondly, the great relationship of our times, the US and China, is under extraordinary tension at present. It's in open competition, almost confrontation. And countries around the world, including Australia, are trying to determine how we manage that divergence, and even should there be a decoupling in areas such as technology or other economic areas between the US and China. I think there are so many other challenges that we face. I mean, the advent of the fourth industrial revolution, our experts tell us that we're only at the beginning of the technological revolution. And as increases in computing power and AI and robotics and the great disruptions of our time only increase, that's going to impact on all countries. And then, look, let's face it, there are plenty of hotspots around the world we could discuss. And climate change, another issue of our time. So there are plenty of matters for us to turn our attention to as we emerge from the COVID pandemic. There will be an end to this pandemic, but I'm afraid it won't be the last global pandemic we face.
Well, Julie, I'm anxious to hear more about your perspective, from your perspective on all of these issues. And you began by mentioning COVID-19. It has been a heck of a year, right? And I know you're a keen observer of the United States as well. And we're going to be emerging from, I think, what you might call a quadruple crisis, right? Of the pandemic, the recession associated with the pandemic, the social divisions that have been laid bare by George Floyd's murder and the aftermath. And then, of course, you might have noticed we had quite a vitriolic political season here with the presidential election. And accompanying all of this has been a bit of skepticism, I think, among Americans about our commitments abroad, and arguments among some that, hey, we just need a period of introspection. But Julie, I think if we learn one thing from COVID-19, it is that challenges that develop abroad can only be dealt with really at an exorbitant cost once they reach our shores. Might you offer a few comments about how you see the importance of the U.S.-Australian alliance in coping with the challenges you just outlined? And could you explain why the alliance is important to Australians, and why, from your perspective, it's important to Americans as well?
Well, I appreciate that the United States is going through a very difficult time. And you're right, the divisions within your communities, within your society, have been laid bare in recent times. And whether it's through this long presidential campaign, I don't know how you do 2-year campaigns, but it was clearly divisive and hyper-partisan, if I might observe. The social unrest, the riots and violent protests were deeply concerning, because the United States is a beacon of freedom and democracy to others in the world. However, I have confidence in America's infinite capacity to reinvent itself and to continue to lead and be an example and a model for others. The United States is still the world's largest economy. It is still by far the largest military. It has a network of alliances around the world that it gives it a strength that no other nation can meet. And that network of friendships, relationships, alliances, whether it be NATO or alliances in the Asia-Pacific, give the United States a powerful reach around the world. We have been concerned, if I might say this, we have been concerned that America seems to be walking away from its commitment to the international rules-based order, or cherry-picking those parts of the order that will apply to the United States and won't apply. Now, by the international rules-based order, I mean that network of conventions and precedents and alliances and institutions underwritten by international law that has evolved since the Second World War. And the United States was the instigator, the defender, the guarantor of that framework that guided how nations would behave and towards each other. And let's face it, it has prevented a third global conflict. It has enabled the rise in economic prosperity of hundreds of millions of people around the world. And we always look to the United States for that leadership. In more recent times, and I don't think it's fair to lay it only at the feet of President Trump and his America First policies and Make America Great Again, but there is this perception that the US now has a zero-sum view of the world, that America can only be great at the expense of other nations. And that's not the United States that we know and respect. So we hope that the United States will continue to show global leadership. And this is where I come back to COVID. In the past, when there's been a global challenge, let's take the terrorism uprisings after September 11, the United States put together coalitions of like-minded countries to combat terrorism around the world. It was the United States who led the counter-terrorism movements, if you like, in countries. After the global financial crisis, it was the United States under President Bush that called the G20 together to say, we've got to fix this, and turned it into a leader level forum. It was a finance minister level forum before that, and said, this is how we're going to work to fix the global financial crisis. Now, history will judge whether they succeeded or not. And then when COVID hit, and we started hearing stories out of China about this pandemic that was so vicious and fast spreading, we expected first the WHO to have protocols in place. After all, there'd been decades of planning and preparing for a global pandemic, but the WHO seemed to be missing in action, and we can surmise why that was. But then we looked to the United States to put together a coalition of countries to say, we can deal with this. These are the protocols for pandemics. This is what we should be doing in terms of restrictions, lockdowns. This is how you balance the public health outcomes with the economic disruption. But the United States then retreated behind its own borders and state by state started dealing with the pandemic, and other countries did as well. And I feel that we lost an opportunity to have a global response. Here in Australia, it's trial and error, state by state. Some states it's worked, other states it hasn't. And leaders are struggling to get that balance right between the public health imperatives and the impact on their domestic and the global economy. So I always look to the United States for direction, for leadership, and we'll continue to do that. And I hope that the perception that the American people want to withdraw and isolate is only that, a perception, because the commitment to freedom and democracy and the values that makes America the country it is are as relevant today as they ever were.
Well, Julie, I'm pretty optimistic about it. I'll tell you, I think this is very important for us to keep in mind your perspective on this. I think that as we emerge from these crises, we're going to emerge in a way that we're stronger ourselves, as you alluded to at the beginning. I mean, we're divided, right? But we have a say in how we're governed. We can provide a corrective to ourselves, short of revolution. That's one of the greatest strengths of our democracy. And I do believe there's a strong faith in our alliances, and I think it's okay to emphasize our sovereignty, not wanting to give it up to international organizations, because international cooperation, as you know, it's based on strong sovereign countries who share principles and values and work together, right, to achieve outcomes. And in this case, we need vast improvements in global health, as you pointed out.
Sure.
Julie, one of the reasons why I think we've had such a difficulty with COVID-19 was, of course, the slow reaction by the World Health Organization. I think it should highlight to us, hey, there's no prize just for membership in these organizations. We have to compete to make sure they're not turned against their purpose. And of course, this is what China has endeavored to do. I think that we see the risk associated with the Chinese Communist Party subversion of these institutions, and a range of aggressive action taken in the midst of the pandemic. Australia suffered a great deal from these aggressive actions, massive cyber attacks across all your sectors, and then these kind of forms of economic coercion aimed at Australia, because you had the temerity to suggest, well, maybe we ought to take a look at how this pandemic originated. So I think we might want to send Xi Jinping a thank you note, because I think he has more than anybody maybe highlighted the importance of alliances and partnerships among like-minded nations. Could you offer some thoughts on Australia's experience now confronting these various forms of aggression of the Chinese Communist Party? You were a leader in highlighting this in 2017. Other Australians like John Garneau in his amazing study of Chinese influence, and then the law you subsequently passed. Could you maybe explain to Americans how Australia was in many ways at the forefront of recognizing the threat from the Chinese Communist Party and the increasingly aggressive actions of the party under Xi Jinping?
Well, let me go back a little and pick up my theme where I was saying that, nations around the world have been concerned that the burden of global leadership is not resting easily on the shoulders of some American people. And so there's an element of nations hedging and preparing for a world where no power takes that role. But in terms of China, there's obviously going to be ongoing and potentially greater tensions with the US and its allies for many years. Now, let's take an example. The US has drawn a line in the sand on China's salami slicing, let me put it that way, approach with regards to its territorial claims, including in the South China Sea, its border with India, the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, and so on. And Australia has likewise been a voice of concern. And the challenge, of course, is always with China that developing nations that once looked to the leading democracies as a model for growth are now looking at China's status model dominated by state-owned enterprises as an alternative. And China is our largest two-way trading partner at present. We have a massive trade surplus. The opposite in the United States, where you have a trade deficit with China, but we have a massive trade surplus. And the first time in our history, our major trading partner in China and our major defence strategic and investment partner in the United States are in open competition. And so Australia has had to manage those relationships, and it hasn't been easy. In my experience, it is possible to have very robust discussions with Chinese officials in private and to lay down some principles. But at the end of the day, the US is the only power with the authority that China ultimately respects and will retreat from. Warnings about Taiwan, East and South China Sea. If those warnings are given, then that impacts on China's decision-making. And we are very aware of that. In the case of Australia, though, we don't have that military authority or that global authority that the United States does. So when Australia acts in a way that meets with Beijing's disapproval, they use economic coercion to get us to toe the line. And in recent years, there have been a number of areas where our worldview has diverged sharply from China's. In terms of cyber attacks, which we can trace back to state-sponsored cyber attacks, where foreign interference has impacted upon our national sovereignty, and we've introduced legislation to deal with what our intelligence and security agencies tell us is foreign interference in our institutions and democratic processes. And then in recent times, we have vocalised our concerns about human rights abuses in China, particularly the Uyghurs in Western China and the treatment of them. And then more recently, our Prime Minister called for an investigation, an inquiry into how the COVID-19 pandemic began and China's role in divulging or not divulging the origins of it, and called for an inquiry. And that incurred China's wrath. We now see our exporters suffering in many of our energy and resource sectors, now in agriculture. Even today, there's a story about our timber exports being rejected. So now it's coal, wine, barley, it goes on and on. Lobsters, we had a case where millions of dollars of fresh lobsters, and China takes about 95% of our, crayfish, lobsters, takes about 95% of our trade. It was just left sitting on a wharf. And, this is having an economic impact. It does mean that the old saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket, comes home to remind us that we need to diversify our export approach. We need free trade agreements with other countries around the world. And to be fair, we have been doing that for some time. But still, without doubt, China is our biggest destination for our iron ore, which is our number one export item. And so when those sorts of responses occur, it really does put you on edge. And the Australian government, I assume, is trying to work behind the scenes, but the message that we get publicly is that China's just not picking up the phone. So, those counterpart to counterpart connections that obviously work so well in times of difficulty in relationships seem not to be occurring at present. And, you will remember, HR, you'll remember visiting China, and there's never an occasion where or rarely an occasion where Chinese officials don't remind you that China is a nation on the rise, the United States and its allies are nations on the decline. So we'll have to work through this with China, but I think managing the relationship with China is going to be one of the great challenges, not only of our country, but most certainly of the United States as well.
And Julie, I think this highlights really the first part of our discussion, the importance of alliances, right? If Americans are asking the question, why is it important? Oh, it's important because if China succeeds in playing us off against each other and picking off free and open societies, the world will be less free, less prosperous, and less safe. And we're so much stronger when we act together. And I would just say, let's eat more, Australian lobsters and drink more Australian wine.
I'll encourage you to do that. Most certainly. Our region, the Indo-Pacific, China is a very dominant regional player, and many countries are hedging and preparing for a world where China is even more dominant. But I can assure you, countries in our region, when you talk to them, they don't want to live in a world where China is the only power. They want to live in a world where the United States shows more leadership, not less. They don't want to live in a world where only China calls the shots. And I think that China's assertiveness, particularly during COVID, is making a number of nations think twice. Now, to be fair about China, it's facing its own challenges. It most certainly has a demographic challenge. Its nation is getting older, and there's a saying, they don't want to get old before they get rich, but their demographic challenge is one of the fastest aging populations in the world, which comes from distortions of its one-child policy. And apparently the proportion of new working age adults to those in retirement is working against them. And of course, China is yet to avoid the middle income trap. And as an authoritarian regime, its history says that centrally planned states have yet to overcome that. So China can't afford to be reckless. Let me put it that way. I think even though its model is being put forward to emerging countries as one to be embraced, at the end of the day, China can't afford to be reckless, because it does have its own challenges and economic challenges as well as demographic. So, and there are enormous mountains of debt, particularly at the provincial and city level, and still large, inefficient state-owned enterprises dominate parts of its economy. So while it's a significant economic and world power, it's not in a position where it can be reckless in its dealings with the rest of the world.
And I think when we work together with Australia, with Japan and India, this format of the Quad has taken on kind of a new prominence. I think, again, thank you to Xi Jinping, maybe in order there. I think, Julie, that Australia is in a great position as well to clarify, I think, some misunderstandings about the competition with China. This is not a U.S.-China problem. I mean, this is a free world China problem. When you look at the bludgeoning of Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier, the aggressive actions we've talked about in connection with Australia, the threats to Japan, and now I think increasingly Taiwan is a very dangerous flashpoint, having seen the party already extend its repressive arm in Hong Kong. I think Taiwan is directly in the sights of the party. So what concerns you the most about next steps, and And what do you see for the Quad? What is the potential there? And what do you think the next agenda items ought to be for reinvigorated alliances and partnerships among our free and open societies?
Well, first, I don't see the China-US relationship in terms of a Cold War. I mean, China is not the USSR. The USSR, as you will recall, was essentially a parallel universe. It had its own economy. Its citizens didn't travel the world. It was a bubble. China, of course, has opened its economy to the world. It's not playing by the same
on its own terms, right? They're happy for us to finance their defense buildup and their efforts to gain an unfair advantage in the emerging global economy as well.
Indeed, but Chinese citizens travel in their millions. Pre-COVID, we have a significant number of Chinese students studying in our universities. Our largest source of tourists is now, apart from New Zealand, is now China. So Chinese citizens are travelling the world, and they do have the opportunity to experience freedom abroad and to learn from democracies and observe how people live, as opposed to the USSR. But what does concern me is the decoupling. If China sets up its own trading and financial rules, its own internet, its own AI, its own zero-sum geostrategic view of the world, that will cause countries to have to choose. And some who have basically put their lot in with China through the Belt Road Initiative, through being funded, these debt for equity swaps that have occurred in Africa and the Pacific and elsewhere. I do fear that will lead to a divergence. From Australia's point of view, we obviously want to continue to work closely with the United States, but like-minded countries, and you mentioned the Quad, I was very interested to see that the Quad, India, Japan, Australia and the United States, has been elevated to foreign minister, foreign secretary level. When I was foreign minister, it had met
we got stuck for a while, right?
Senior officials level. Yeah, there was a rather unfortunate situation back when John Howard was prime minister. The Quad was formed, and then when there was a change of government, the new government kind of crab walked away from the Quad, and the announcement was made in the presence of the Chinese ambassador, as I recall. It was, not a good look. Anyway, India, I think quite rightly, became very wary of it and somewhat cynical and retreated to its, non-aligned movement status. But now, interestingly, during this COVID period, the four countries have come together, and we are the largest democracies in our part of the world. And I think that the Quad is a great opportunity for like-minded countries to share ideas, perspectives, and give other countries a model to look to. I was hoping that the United States would continue to be involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, I know free trade agreements is politically difficult in the United States, and there's a bit of, protectionist thinking going on, bringing jobs back home, and there's some truth to that. I don't think global economists really did appreciate the impact that Chinese manufacturing would have on the American worker. Even Paul Krugman has agreed that globalization has impacted on the United States in ways not expected. But nevertheless, we know that populist policies, not populist in the I don't mean popular policies. All elected officials need to have popular policies, but populist in the sense that, short-term responses that might be popular can have devastating long-term consequences. And we do need free and open trade. So, we hope that the United States continues to be the great consuming nation that it is, but also a great example of how we can set very high benchmarks, gold standards for trade between nations. And that's something that we hope that the United States, I know the Trans-Pacific Partnership is somewhat political, but nevertheless, the United States continue to uphold those principles. I think the World Trade Organization, it's not perfect, but it certainly needs some reform, and the United States would be of great assistance in, for example, agreeing to some appellate judges in the WTO so that we can actually have trade disputes arbitrated or determined. That would be.
I think that the word that would resonate with Americans more is reciprocity, right? This is a Donald Trump word. And I think what has put, but it should have appeal across both parties. I do think the era of multilateral trade agreements is probably dead for now across both parties. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that if Secretary Clinton had been elected, that she also had said that she would not engage in TPP. But Julie, I wonder, you mentioned these other really key competitions in terms of data standards, right? Internet privacy standards, other standards that will be important to how the next global economy develops, this data-driven global economy. There are elements of TPP in these areas that could be applied, I think, multilaterally, that could be taken in to a format like the Quad, or some people have said there should be a group of 10 countries, for example, that help set these standards. Do you see an opportunity to maybe just take pieces of the TPP that make sense, especially in terms of in the perspective of the competition with the mercantilist statist model that China's exporting? Do you see that there's promise for that kind of an approach?
Absolutely. I mean, the TPP, that's, going back to 2016, 2015, 16. And sure, we all signed up to it. So it's now 11 nations. And the good news about that is significant economies like Japan and Mexico and others Singapore, Australia were part of that agreement. So there are aspects of the TPP that could be adopted elsewhere. I mean, the thing about the TPP was we were hoping other countries would come on board with the benchmarks and standards that have been set. In the data space, I think this is a significant concern. I mean, one of the greatest gifts that the United States has provided to the world, and there have been many since the Second World War, but one of the greatest gifts has been universal access to the internet, let's face it, and that has set a standard. But now that the United States and others have banned Chinese entities from, say, the development of 5G networks, well, China's gone off and developed its own. And where some companies, because they're state-owned enterprises and on national security grounds, have been banned from the US and its allies, well, then China sets up its own. So it's got an alternate AI. Well, it's basically got its own internet now. And, the Great China Firewall, as they say, and AI developing in its own way. And I think that this is an area ripe for alliance collaboration where, some of the great companies around the world are not necessarily in the United States in the 5G network, for example, Ericsson and others. So there are many countries that would want to have a global platform of collaboration in the technology space. And that's, again, the United States is such a brilliant innovator in that area. And I think that it can continue to lead and show global leadership. And there will be plenty of countries who'd be prepared to be part of it. I think what President Trump has demonstrated is that America shouldn't have to do this alone. And, just switching topics, but like its relationship with NATO and the contribution that some of the NATO members should have made to the collective defence. And he laid that bare. And I think while some of the NATO countries might have been offended by his tone or his blunt approach, at the end of the day, they did recognise that he had a point, that you cannot just sit back and expect the United States to carry the burden, that we all have to share it. And that can be across many different areas of endeavour.
Yeah, Julie, just in connection with this competition on fifth generation communications infrastructure, and I think a question that we should just ask countries who are making this choice is, do you really expect the Chinese Communist Party to treat your citizens better than they treat their own people? And I think an important message as well to countries who say, gosh, I don't want to be caught between the United States and China. I have to choose. No, we're not. I don't think we should ask anybody to choose between the United States and China. We should ask them to choose between sovereignty and servitude. That's the real choice, I think.
Well, the way Australia puts it is we say we don't have to choose, we just have to act in our national interest. What's in the best interests of Australia? And then obviously, we're a free, open, liberal democracy. We're committed to freedoms, the rule of law, democratic institutions. That's who we are. We're an open, export-oriented market economy. We have a standard of living and economic growth that depends upon our ability to sell our high-quality goods and services around the world. But it's got to be according to a set of rules, and players have to play by the rules. So we look at it through our national interest, and that enables you to position yourself where you need to be. And I think in the IT space, as you say, there are plenty of companies in China who say, well, we're a private sector company, but that's not the way Chinese law works. You act at the direction of the central government, and that's a fundamental difference that I think people need to appreciate.
Julie, I wonder if we might talk about another really important area of international cooperation, an area that I had just a tremendous experience with your courageous Australian soldiers in Iraq and especially in Afghanistan over the years. I am concerned that we are taking our eyes away from this problem of jihadist terrorism at a time when these groups might be becoming even more potent and even more dangerous. And this is the case, I think, in connection with the problem set in South Asia and in Afghanistan in particular. And I think our move to disengage from there has prioritized disengagement over, I think, some grave dangers. Could you tell me how you think about the problem of jihadist terrorism broadly, and what you think are the most important actions we should take together across our alliance and with like-minded countries?
Well, to put it in an historic context, in 2016, we celebrated 100 years of mateship, as the Australians put it. That is the first time the Australians and the Americans fought together, and it happened to be under the leadership of an Australian general, Sir John Monash, was in 1916, the Battle of Hamel, where US and Australian soldiers fought together to turn the tide of World War I. And since that time, Australia has been side by side with the United States in every significant battle or conflict that the United States has had to wage, whether it was World War II, whether it was Korea, Vietnam, and now Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Middle East. So Australia and the United States have an incredible degree of interoperability, as you would appreciate, in our defence capability. Our soldiers, our defence personnel know and trust and respect each other. There's an incredible degree of connection between us. And we share a worldview on terrorism and the challenges it faces. You're absolutely right, though. During COVID, as everybody has retreated to behind borders to consider their own domestic challenges, and as great as they are, there isn't the focus on what's actually happening in some of these places where jihadism and terrorist groups were proliferating. I remember in 2014 when it was really at its height, I think, when Australia and the United States went back into Iraq, and we were trying to, at the invitation of the Iraqi government, we were trying to deal with ISIS. And there was a moment when there was a fear that ISIS was going to march on Baghdad. And, we kind of forget that that's how terrifying it had been. And then, of course, it went into Syria and what's happened in Syria. I think that, again, we can't assume that it's all gone away because the world's diverted its attention to pandemics. There are still significant hotspots around the world that will require powerful nations to put an end to it, put an end to the kind of brutal jihadist activity that is still there. I mean, every now and then you'll get a story about terrorists with suicide bombings or attacks on civilians, and it reminds you that this is still an ever-present problem. Again, Australia is a willing partner. We're still in Afghanistan, still in Iraq, but we certainly haven't eliminated the jihadists, the terrorist scourge that has impacted on so many families in our country and yours. And I just hope that our alliance means that we continue to be a force for good in the world.
Right, and I think a way to share the burden so we can manage the costs and of really an insurance policy to make sure that these devastating attacks that both our countries have suffered never happen again. And also, I think it's important to recognize that it is the Afghans, for example, or the Iraqis who are bearing the brunt of this fight, and we're enabling them to do that. There is this drive, though, toward retrenchment that cuts really across all sectors, Julie. And I wonder if you might share what you think are other global threats that we have to deal with, other threats like jihadist terrorism or like a pandemic, right? That don't respect national boundaries and therefore have to be dealt with through multinational cooperation. I'm thinking of maybe these interconnected problems of energy security and environment and climate change and food and water security. What do you think should be top on our agenda for the U.S. and Australia to work together to bring other nations alongside us and to make sure that we build a better future for generations to come?
Just on jihadism, before I answer that, I was thinking as you were talking about how one of the issues that I was dealing with before I resigned as foreign minister was the emergence of ISIS pools in our part of the world, in the Philippines in particular. And under President Duterte, he had a particularly unorthodox view of the United States. He's a rather unorthodox president. But anyway, he wasn't particularly enamored with the United States until they found pockets of jihadists in the southern Philippines, and then turned very swiftly to the United States to help with intelligence and other forms of defensive capability. And Australia was part of that assistance as well. So, when we talk about some of these challenges in our part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific, the United States is still very much a power that our nations turn to, even if President Duterte was his campaign platform was, one might say, slightly anti-American. Nevertheless, when the chips were down, he turned to the US, and now is quite actively provoking China by reinstating the UNCLOS arbitration over contested territorial claims, Philippines against China. When he first came in, he said, "Oh, don't worry about that. We can work happily with China." Well, now he's sort of saying, "Hang on, I've got an arbitration in my favour, and I want to rely on this arbitration." So territorial claims in our part of the world are still alive and active. I think some of the other global challenges, yes, climate change and the quest towards renewable energy, cleaner, greener energy sources. Now, this is a huge challenge for Australia. Our economy has been built on supplies of
President
cheap.
would say beautiful coal is what he would call it.
Yeah, well, cheap, and that's we have a massive amount of coal. We have coal-fired power stations, and so this transition away from what had been a strength in Australia's economic growth is very hard for many people. Of course, we have masses of uranium, and nuclear power may well be seen as a clean, green power, but we can't even get to first base on a debate on nuclear power in our country. We do not have nuclear power stations. We export uranium to other countries who use nuclear power, but in a rather well, it's just the way it is in Australia. You can't even have a debate about the idea of nuclear power without it causing a great deal of anxiety. So some of the other forms of renewable power, gas, and thermal, we've got hydropower in Australia. This is an area where I think technology will be the answer. It'll be technological breakthroughs that will, innovative and creative thinking on how to ensure that our environment is as clean and green and safe as it can be. And again, those kind of partnerships, research partnerships, working with other like-minded countries. I note that should a Biden administration come into being and President Biden be inaugurated in January, and I accept that there are legal challenges underway, but a Biden administration would rejoin the Paris Agreement. I think that is important, again, just to show that the United States is prepared to be part of a global solution. The United States is a major emitter of greenhouse gases, and that it's prepared to work with other countries to achieve better outcomes around the world.
Julie, I'm sure the Biden administration will re-enter the Paris Agreement. What I'm concerned about is the Paris Agreement is not the solution. It actually makes us feel good about ourselves, but it's another non-solution. And I think what you're alluding to is that we need solutions that apply in developing economies as well. And
Sure.
The conversion to natural gas is, as you mentioned, that's hugely important. It was the biggest reduction in man-made emissions ever in history was when the U.S. converted many of our coal plants to natural gas.
Sure.
And then this combination of that and renewables and nuclear power. It's always interesting to me how advocates for the non-solutions like the Green New Deal here in the United States are also anti-nuclear. Like you can't really be both if you want hope for the planet here. So
you can't even have a debate about it here. If you say, look, nuclear is zero emissions, but they don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about solar or wind, and you say, but it's not 24/7 base load. Well, that doesn't matter. It's a debate that I was Minister for Science at one point, and I recall getting a detailed analysis of the business case for nuclear power in Australia. And at that time, because we had plentiful supplies of cheap coal, the business case couldn't be made without massive government subsidy. And that could change over time, but people's attention is most certainly on gas. Australia is, I think we've just overtaken Qatar as the largest exporter of LNG in the world. Yeah, I think we did.
And the U.S. is actually, it's a growing export for the United States as well, and I think an opportunity to diversify some energy sources for countries like Japan as well and others who.
Yeah, you look at a country like India, where there are still parts of the country that don't have electricity or have very unstable supplies of electricity. And, they're desperate for cheap forms of power at the most basic level. And so we do need to support those countries with technology. And I think the wonderful thing about technology is it can leapfrog. You don't have to go through all the processes. You can leapfrog to the best outcome that's available at the time.
Right. Well, Julie, you've been so generous with your time. I'd like to ask you just one final open-ended question. There will be a new administration here in the United States on January 20th. What advice would you have for President-elect Biden and his team about the future of our alliance, and what should he put on the top of his list for the United States and Australia to work together on?
Well, on the assumption that it's a Biden administration, and I'm only saying that because I believe there's been no concession from President Trump at this point, but on the assumption that it's a Biden administration, Australia is going to welcome it, as we always do, because the alliance between Australia and the United States is deep, it's long-standing, it is enduring. And we've always said that whomever is in the White House and whomever's in the lodge in Canberra, that connection between our people will endure. We know Joe Biden, he's been to Australia. He's been in public life for a very long time. We're assuming that perhaps some of the senior figures from the Obama administration may feature in a new Biden administration. So there are people that our people will have worked with and will be familiar with. But I'm sure our Prime Minister, in a conversation he had recently with President-elect Biden, has given the assurance that the alliance is still the bedrock of Australia's strategic outlook, and that we'll continue to provide the support, the friendship, and the connections with the United States that have enabled Australia to be the country that we are today, and that it is possible for the United States to continue to be a principled and reliable global leader as long as its friends and allies maintain their support. And in Australia, you have an enduring friendship.
Well, Julie, please share with all of our Australian friends. We're confident here. I mean, it's been a rough year, but I think it shows the vibrancy of our democracy, what we've just gone through, and I can't thank you enough, Julie Bishop, for being with us. On behalf of the Hoover Institution, thank you for helping us learn more about Battlegrounds, important to building a better future, a future of peace and prosperity for generations to come. You know, I benefited from your wisdom on my first day on the job as National Security Advisor, and I've done so again, and so have our viewers, thanks to you joining us tonight.
It's wonderful to keep in touch with you, HR, and stay safe, and all the very best as we look forward to that long and continuing and enduring relationship between the United States and Australia.
Battlegrounds is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.